Welcome to Money Talks. I'm Genevieve Westcott with your latest financial news from across New Zealand and around the globe. Coming up, Fonterra slips down the ranks in the world's who's who's of dairy companies. What's the outlook for dairy production globally and here at home? What's our biggest company got to do to get the nod from the New Zealand Commerce Commission to expand its portfolio of dairy companies? Meantime, the Kiwi dollar continues to strengthen. What's Spain got to do with it? All this and much, much more. Kicking off with our rural roundup, starting with dairy. Now, we know prices continue to edge down at the global dairy trade auction, down 5.9%. Joining us today is Rural Segment General Manager with the ASB, Grant Abbott. Grant, great to have you on the show as always.
Great to be here, Genevieve.
Now, apparently dairy prices around the world have been down, what, a third over the past 12 to 18 months. It ain't getting any better, is it?
Well, it's actually a quarter for the US in terms of the last USDA numbers.
A quarter for the US,
in
wow.
terms of the milk payout. And on top of that, the fact is, of course, that with this possible drought going on, feed prices are increasing. Costs across the board for farmers generally increasing more than the CPI of the particular country. All points to quite a big squeeze. Yeah,
and tracking how global dairy prices are moving, what are you picking for Fonterra's payout?
I think at this point, the $5.50 which they're talking about is probably as good a view as any. But of course, with the drought going on in the US is the second largest exporter of milk products in the world. There could be some significant impacts there in terms of shutting down their supply. And of course, climate across the world. Here in New Zealand, we're at the end of a season which was dominated by the grass market and increased productivity. The Aussies had a good year too in terms of the milk production. And then, of course, we've got to take into consideration the currency as well. So, the currency is very volatile at the moment. It's been up over the 80-cent mark. Recently, it's now down 1.5 cents to around 78.5 or so US cents. Another key thing. An interesting statistic for you, in terms of the last payout year, it was the first time Fonterra has actually got within 10% in terms of its opening estimate relative to what the actual payout actually looks like. And
so does this mean their number crunchers are getting smarter?
Oh, I guess you could possibly look at it that way. But yeah. As I say, there are a lot of moving parts, so it's very difficult to put a line in the sand, I think.
Meantime, Fonterra won't be happy. Rabobank's latest survey of all the big dairy companies in the world by revenue, we see Fonterra has fallen from third to fourth spot. Talk to me about that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Of course, it's based on revenue. And one of the things that came out in terms of the strategic update was this need to go into higher value products. And obviously that's where Fonterra is definitely heading. The commoditisation of the whole milk powder, the skim milk powder, that's not actually creating that much value. And I guess it also comes back to the debate around TAF in terms of trading amongst farmers. The need for Fonterra to have a good platform in terms of being able to invest in its business to create those value-added products.
Yeah, I see that top of the heap is Nestle of Switzerland, no surprises there, followed by France's Danone and Lactalis, also of France. Apparently, most of the companies continue to be dominated in the OECD regions, but China now is moving into the top 20. Absolutely.
And of course, they're growing their herds, growing their production. The key piece there, of course, though, is that while supply is definitely growing, the view is that demand is going to well continue to outstrip it. And again, an interesting statistic. In terms of the consumption, the average consumption of every man, woman and child in the developed world, they consume a little over 200 kilos of dairy products a year. In the developing countries, any idea what it looks like?
Wouldn't know.
About 70 kilos.
70 kilos, okay.
So it gives you an idea of in terms of that growing demand in the Chinese market and indeed all those developing markets. There's a long way to go.
I see here at home the Commerce Commission has put out its set of rules for Fonterra if it hopes to buy up that dairy company Studholme.
Well, it hasn't necessarily put out its rules yet. Basically, what's happened is that Fonterra has been at this stage the pole position with respect to the acquisition of that Studholme dairy plant, formerly owned by a Russian entity. And they've effectively put in this application in terms of why we should be allowed to buy it. And amongst the interesting parts in there are the view of the market. So obviously if you've got an issue around domination of the market, you've got to define what the market is. The last time that the Commerce Commission looked at the market size was about the time that Fonterra was actually formed. And the view then was that you look at effectively a distance around the particular plant you're talking about, so 150 kilometres or thereabouts. Fonterra is arguing that in terms of the market that Studholme's in, it's the whole South Island.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because, of course, there's a contrary piece of writing that's come in from Westland Dairy.
Yeah, they're not happy.
They are not happy. They are not happy at all. They say, in fact, it's got to be that 150 kilometre radius, because of the fact that, yes, you can transport milk over large distances, but it doesn't make a lot of economic sense.
And yet Fed farmers are right in behind with Fonterra. They think it's a great idea.
They're focusing very much on the farmer outcome, and they pose a particularly apt question, that question being, well, when else have you actually seen a receivership where effectively the suppliers stand to actually get most of their money back? And it's a very good question. Federated farmers, though, do question, there's a number of requirements in terms of the deal going through. One of them is that all of New Zealand dairy companies' former suppliers have actually got to sign up to the deal, so effectively they're locked in. And not only that, they're locked in for 7 years. Fed Farmer says 7 years, it's possibly a bit long. And again, Westland says the only reason they're doing this is effectively to lock those suppliers away from us. So in that space, there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge, I think.
Now, Grant, I wanted you to talk to me a little bit about an organization that you check out a lot and you think our farmers ought to be keeping an eye on, Momagri. This is a French organization. Tell me about it.
Basically, it's a self-styled watchdog, basically, in terms of looking over the world agricultural markets. And effectively, it's just put out this framework in terms of evaluating the amount of support that a government provides to its farming sector. The reason being that, you know, in terms of trade talks and that kind of thing, there's a lot of gum bashing about how much support actually goes in. It's very difficult to compare what one country's doing relative to another.
Sure.
So basically, they're proposing this framework to evaluate on an objective basis how much support is actually being provided, so that when we get to those trade talks, hopefully we can get down to the narrow issues and talk about how we can actually reduce these limits in terms of quotas and other forms of support.
So what interesting things have you discovered that perhaps you weren't so aware of in terms of subsidies and tariffs?
Well, the interesting thing is that Momagri breaks down the list of supports down to 10 different supports. Some of them are the obvious ones, like just the subsidies and that kind of thing. Then they get down to the slightly more arcane in terms of things like US food aid, for example, where the US Department of Agriculture buys up food to effectively provide to undernourished around the world and in the US. Also, there's a feature around manipulation. It's possibly too strong a word, but we'll use it anyway. Manipulation of currency and interest rates to effectively give farmers a hand up. And it's interesting when you look at those sort of very, very broad range of tools that are available, and you can see why it is very difficult to compare. But I guess the big thing for me was exactly how much the US actually pumps into its farmers. More than 170 billion euros. Now, just to put that in perspective, last year was a bumper for New Zealand dairy exports. Right. We did roughly just a little over 7 billion dairy exports. That gives you an idea of the huge scale of the money which is being pumped into supporting of these farmers. Yeah, and it's interesting because the US has been bleeding on about China and all the subsidies and the hands up they give their own people in all kinds of industries, but really American farmers, they're doing it sweet, aren't they? Oh, absolutely, and in fact the trend is that they're getting more. From 2005 to 2010, it's been an upward swing. Interesting though, in Europe it's been downward from 2008. And they have roughly, I think, about 75 billion euros of support going on at the moment. And, you know, there are very often huge arguments between the US and the European Union about who's doing what to who. It's very interesting. Yeah, and listen, with all the trade deals going on and all the talk of our government officials about being tough when it comes to US agriculture, for example, Trans-Pacific Partnership, really, are we ever going to beat these guys? Sadly, we are a pimple. Yeah, we are a pimple. And that's where it lies. You know, one of the things that we do have with our grass-based pastoral system, we do have a huge competitive advantage. And these other countries do actually need to pump this kind of thing in just to effectively try and attain parity. And it's just very demonstrative of how efficient we are actually here in New Zealand. We're going to actually talk about what's happening to the corn and soy in the U.S. with the drought. More on that when we come back. Thanks, Grant. Sure. Coming up after the break, the crisis in corn. Half of the world's supplies burning up in cornfields across the United States, the devastation of the drought, and the implications for world markets. Finance Minister Bill English warns it'll take a generation to sort out the world's economic woes, with at least 10 years of tough times ahead. And the latest fallout from Spain and its implications for our dollar up against the euro. All this coming up next.
But first, answer this in our Farmers' Facts and Figures quiz. According to the citizens of this small but powerful Isle nation, what is our most trusted brand? Hint, it's a food product. This is according to the Reader's Digest Most Trusted list. The answer when we return. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, what's our most trusted brand? Whittaker's. It seems we trust chocolate makers above all else. Joining us now is Jeff Matthews, Senior Financial Advisor for Spicers. And Jeff, let's talk about those asset sales. The government's going to give some loyalty bonus shares out to mom and dad investors, as they say. This seems to be totally crazy.
I agree. If it was such a great deal, they'd be like Facebook shares. There'd be a huge demand for them, and there isn't. I mean, there are people who've been phoning up asking about it, but I think a much better way for people to get an exposure is probably through KiwiSaver accounts. You know, they're going to get a spread of the markets. What concerns me about the local market is you've got 4 power companies coming onto the market, and we've already got 3 power companies with Contact, Vector and Trustpower. So the New Zealand share market starts to look like, you know, a utility sector with only power companies. There's no banks, there's no insurance companies, so it's not a great spread of investments just to be investing in regulated power companies. So I think the growth potential, it's not like you're going to buy them for $1 and in a couple of years' time they're going to be $3.
No, you're not going to make a lot of money in them anyway.
I don't think
what's the point? What's the point? Grant, what's your take on it?
And it's interesting, I guess, coming from a good working class background myself, the primary objection I have is that the New Zealand taxpayers theoretically already own these assets.
Exactly.
And now they're selling them back to us. I find that quite a hard pill to swallow, to be honest.
And who is likely to want to put money into them anyways? You know, if you got a mortgage, you're going to want to pay off your mortgage first of all, aren't you?
I think that's right. Whether you've got this economic uncertainty going on out there, you know, there are huge issues about exactly where the world economy is going. And also this point that potentially is going to be privatisations in Europe too. So in terms of the international investor dollar, where's that going to go?
Did you hear Finance Minister Bill English's comments to the party faithful over the weekend that he figures it's going to be really tough times for 10 to 12 years around the world and here in New Zealand? He's calling it now a generational problem. Does that strike dread into your heart?
Does it strike dread? It will be interesting to see exactly how this pans out. Certainly the systemic issues which are wrapping around Europe are going to be very, very hard to resolve. In terms of this austerity kind of measures, that seems to be exacerbating the problems. And then, of course, we've got the potential of slowdown in terms of China. The Australians have been told that potentially their resource boom has got 2 more years to run.
It could be 2 more years. That's not very long at all. I mean, that to me seems almost inconceivable.
I guess the one, from an agricultural point of view, the one high point for us is the population continues to get bigger, and somewhere along the line they've got to be fed. People have got to eat. You can't eat iron ore. You know, there is a bright spot there for New Zealand, and while I wouldn't want to make light of other people's sort of sufferings, it's you know, it's a potentially bright spot for us.
How's the New Zealand dollar doing at the moment, Jeff?
I think Grant said it was 70, 78.5, 79. I looked at it yesterday. It's bobbling around depending on what's happening with bond yields in Spain, and I mean, the New Zealand dollar is pretty volatile anyway at the best of times. Are
you picking though that it's going to continue to strengthen towards the end of the year?
Yeah.
Yep. What about you, Grant?
I think it will potentially strengthen, not because of any great strength of our economy, but because of what's happening everywhere else.
Yeah.
When you look at Greece and places like, they've already had 5 years of recession. You know, their GDP has already dropped 20%. Okay,
let's go to Spain. Eurozone finance ministers on Friday had a meeting, did the deal. They are going to give more money to Spain, but my God, even the regional governments now, the regional cities in Spain are looking for money.
Well, they've got the begging bowl out. I mean, but you know, we knew months and months ago that Catalonia had you know, budget shortfalls, and what they're looking at is, rather than trying to raise sales tax in their region, is they're coming to, you know, the state, the federal government looking for a bailout.
And I see now that Germany, Moody's has downgraded Germany's, it's AAA credit rating is no more. They're mad at the Germans because the Germans aren't paying out enough money to keep the rest of Europe afloat, apparently.
Not downgraded yet. Put them on a negative outlook.
Oh, they're on a negative outlook, so they're not quite down.
Not only that, the Netherlands and Luxembourg too. Netherlands being one of the strong bastions of the European Union as well. The German finance minister came out and said that Germany is still intent on saving the euro, but in terms of some of the data that came out overnight, the Greek Prime Minister said that the Greek economy had contracted in the first part of this year by 0.7%. That compares to Spain, it's contracted by 0.4%. They're talking about Spanish unemployment still peaking at around 25%. How these countries are actually going to recover, they're talking about actually going back into surpluses and economic growth by 2014. It seems a little hard to believe. The Spanish bond yields this morning, the 10-year bond went to 7.62.
Yep. Anytime over 7, alarm bells ring.
Yep.
And then you've got, Swedish bonds at 1.2, UK bonds at 1.4, German bonds at 1.2, and nominally they're supposed to be the same. They're, European 10-year bonds. There's a huge discrepancy. Mind, you could always buy Greek bonds, just under 27%. And there's one for your portfolio.
There you go, yeah. Let's talk about the United States. I know that you are an optimist. You think things aren't as bad there as
I try to be a half-glass full guy.
You do try, but even you are struggling a little bit.
It's been a lot of bad news lately. I mean, you had the kind of LIBOR banking scandal, which is really kind of blown. I mean, we knew about it several years ago, but it's finally come out in the open. Barclays are going to pay something like $500 million of fines, and then there's going to be a whole bunch of other European banks that are going to be in the gun for manipulating what is an interbank market. At the same time, JP Morgan Chase, which is one of the best managed banks in the US, suddenly had kind of a rogue element in London, and they've had to write off $5 or $6 billion worth of assets. So they're just kind of one thing after the other. And then you've got Spain, and then you've got elections. I mean, there's not a lot of positive stuff. You've got the drought. I mean,
now we got the drought, and it is really affecting not only corn but a soybean. What are you hearing out of the Midwest?
Well, it's still relatively early days yet, but the trajectory in terms of the pastoral quality and what have you is basically plummeting. The view is that it will definitely reach the 1998 drought. The question is whether it's actually going to get any worse. One of the key things is it's not just the current year which is impacted. The fact that the feed dries up means a lot of animals end up being slaughtered.
Correct, and that's already happening in the States. Yeah, that's
Yep.
already underway.
But the outcome is then that it takes time to, it takes about 30 seconds to put a knife through a beast's throat, but it takes a hell of a lot longer to actually get them back to grow a new one back into production.
And think about it, 55% of the U.S. is now in drought, and
Yep.
there is apparently no end in sight.
No. For Nebraska, I saw it's the worst drought since 1956, and temperatures over 100 degrees Fahrenheit most days. So, and August is usually a pretty hot month.
August is the dog days of summer, they say,
Yep,
where I come
exactly.
from. Absolutely. Corn prices at a 13-month high. And are you picking going even higher?
Well, I think they will. The USDA basically revised down US corn production by something like 46 million tonnes. That's roughly twice last year's Argentinian total production, just to give you an idea of how big it is. And that's going to have an impact. It's going to have a significant impact in terms of the feed, in terms of potentially things like ethanol and that kind of thing as well.
Yeah. Well, even crazier. I mean, they're putting corn into ethanol. I mean, I can't figure that out with the hungry world. They're crazy. But soybean, what's happening with the soybean? Is it really parallel to what's happening with corn?
It's beginning to get that way, and one of the key things is that the US exports a lot of soybean to China. It goes into animal feed there, so the estimates in terms of what China's going to actually be able to afford to import going backwards as well. And again, though, to put a silver lining to the dark cloud for New Zealand farmers, it's a good thing. We're not dependent on that kind of feed. There are issues in terms of the beef space around grain-fed beef and marbling versus pasture-fed and all that kind of thing. But to put my New Zealand agricultural hat on it, this is good news for New Zealand's farmers, absolutely.
Yeah, and we need some, quite frankly. Okay, thanks, gentlemen. Coming up after the break, future proof on the highways and byways of the economic world, as our experts point out what's coming up. But first, they'll be popping the champagne corks over at CRT. The South Island Farming Co-op announced it will return a record $9.75 million to its shareholders after its turnover climbed 18%. So answer this in our Farmers Facts and Figures quiz. How much is CRT's latest turnover? The answer when we come back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Money Talks. Just before the break, we asked you, how much is CRT's latest turnover? $1.3 billion. Since 2008, CRT's revenues more than doubled. And now it's time for Future Proof. What's coming up for our experts? Grant, I know you wanted to talk about the independent report that came out recently into the kiwi fruit debacle, if you like, the PSAV disease. Tell me more. So
this independent report basically was looking at what was in those days the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries border controls in terms of how did PSA effectively get into the country. One of the key outtakes was that in a systemic sense our border controls are pretty good. But one of the really interesting things it pointed out was that there was a lack of communication between the kiwi fruit industry body and the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries in terms of developments which were going on offshore, and that would have prompted MAF to potentially tighten up what was actually going on in terms of those border controls. So that's quite interesting because there are sort of certainly parallels in the currently around pastoral farming. So what I'm referring to is, of course, Schmallenbergs.
Yes, yes.
So what you actually see with a lot of these things, including BSE, is it's the actual vector, how the particular disease is actually brought in, is usually not discovered till sometime down the track. So you really need to have prevention, and you need to have a very broad mind, because in the BSE case, the actual prion which actually causes it has still not actually been specifically identified. It's a protein and it's very, very hard to isolate. So actually having some kind of forewarning about these problems and effectively heightening the security and that kind of thing is very important.
Yeah, it is, and I wonder if they have really learned. It's like industry assumed government was taking care of business, government assumed industry was onto it. I think the right hand wasn't talking to the left. And I wonder, is this kind of endemic in Kiwi culture? That, you know, we like being looked after. We want the government to solve our problems.
Potentially.
You know, I'm an immigrant. I can say that. What do you feel as a Kiwi?
I would assume it's probably a genuine distrust of government organisations. However, I think the problem we have here is that the outcomes of getting it wrong, as have been graphically demonstrated with PSA, are crippling. Now, kiwi, not to belittle it, kiwi fruit in terms of New Zealand's agriculture output's relatively small. If you have a look at what Biosecurity New Zealand says and the outcomes of an outbreak of foot and mouth would be, that's eye-watering. Yeah. Basically, it's saying that there'd be that GDP would contract by something like $10 million over, $10 billion over 2 years, and would continue to increase exponentially over time. It would result in roughly 20,000 jobs going to the wall. You know, that's a huge blow to the country if those kind of things eventuate.
But it just shows you what can happen. I mean, I'm not sure if there were budget considerations when they slackened their standards, but, you know, one of the easiest ways is to try and cut, you know, border control, cut back a little bit on being so harsh on, you know, even like these student visas, for example. We suddenly loosen it up and all of a sudden you've got all these kind of problems. And I say you need to be really strict. I mean, we're an agricultural country. You know, we need to make sure that we don't cut corners.
Yeah, and I can remember when I first visited New Zealand quite a few years ago,
they used to
they'd come around and spray.
They still do, but they do it more effectively now through the air conditioning system.
Yeah, but to me, I mean, just very bizarre. But that was my first wake-up call. This is a tiny, tiny little country.
Guys in shorts and knee-high socks would come along and spray you.
Rather
Welcome to New Zealand.
I thought. Yeah.
But Jeff's point is quite interesting around the budget piece. What the report also talks about is the fact that the Ministry for Primary Industries, as it is now, has limited resources, and a lot of what they need to do is effectively identify the risk areas and make sure that the budget that they have is spent on those areas. And again, this is the issue about everybody needs to talk to each other to actually make sure we know what those areas are.
And you're either going to spend the money in prevention or you're going to spend it, you know, when the debacle hits.
You spend 10 times more afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, they got to think about this.
Varroa and PSA shows that once Pandora's box is open, you can't close it.
Yeah, and Varroa's been here for 10 years. And you know what, are we any closer to solving that problem? I don't think so. No. What else are you going to be watching in the next 7 days, Jeff?
Well, I've just been watching the second quarter profits for various companies. Google came in with great results last week. Apple reported about an hour or two ago. On on revenues of 35 billion for the second quarter, profits of just under 10 billion. Market was disappointed because they were expecting slightly higher figures. Most of the corporate numbers have been reasonable given the fact that the kind of global economy has gone flat. So basically looking at company profits and looking at for some kind of resolution out of Europe.
Thanks to my guests, Jeff Matthews and Grant Abbott. Meantime, want to boost your income? Why not explore new ways to put your skills to work like this guy? Keep the faith. See you next time.